senior researcher at Verizon in their risk team, but he's also, I think, probably going to be more well known for being one of the co-authors of Verizon's data breach risk report.
The investigations report.
Data breach investigation report? Okay. So how many of you guys have read that report? Yeah. How many of you guys use that to talk to your management about why? Yeah, okay, I can keep going. But yeah, definitely an awesome paper. We're really excited to have him today talking about open source threat intelligence, so please give him a warm welcome.
All right, well, being from Texas, I'll say aloha, y'all. So, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out here today. Just out of curiosity, how many of you folks are local to the state of Hawaii? Sweet. How many of you folks are flying in from mainland U.S.? And from other countries completely? Excellent, excellent. Good. So we've got a nice broad scope here today. What we're going to be talking about today, as mentioned, is open source threat intelligence. We're going to break down a little bit about what that means. Before we get started, my legal and PR folks really get mad if I don't say something like this. So if I say something dumb and you're like, man, Kyle is a real jerk, and that's just on me. And if you think that about somebody else, that's just on them too. Please don't impute that to me. So, what are we talking about? If I don't know, then we're really going to have a really boring hour, right? But I promise we won't. Let's break it down a little bit. When we talk about open source, we don't really mean open source in the type of in software. Although I am a bit of a, free software, free and Libre and open source software zealot. That's not what we're talking about today. Although when we talk about software today, almost everything that we'll mention will be open source in that sense too. When we talk about open source intel, we're talking about data and information that you can get from overt sources. Traditionally, that meant things like newspapers and phone books and things like that, rather than secretly gathered information. When we talk about threat, we're talking about the parts of risk that don't have anything to do with the assets per se that we're protecting or attacking. We're not talking about vulnerabilities and problems that people find in those. We're talking about, if you've read the DBIR, hopefully everybody has, actors and actions. Primarily, threat really refers to who did something bad, although we're going to expand that a little bit and talk about what quote-unquote bad things they did. We're not focused exactly on investigations, although my team does a lot of those, but certainly we can support those. So anytime that you're trying to just understand what is actually happening in terms of the bad things that are happening. When we talk about intelligence, really, intel is the product of data and analysis, right? You get a lot of information in, some smart folks sit in a room and go through it all and try to understand it and do what they do, and then they provide something out to decision makers who decide what they're going to do based on what they learned. We're going to generalize a little bit for the purposes of this talk to talk about kind of raw data, I guess not really true raw data, but close to it. And we're going to focus on gathering all of these data and the tools that we can use to analyze them and what we might use to analyze them. Why is this important? Well, I'll go very quickly through a couple of pieces from the DBIR. You may have seen this figure in there. This is how quickly breaches happen and how quickly we discover them. So if you look at it, the top row is how long it takes from the initial attack on average to a compromise. And if you look at the bottom, it's kind of a little bit qualitative, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. So like 85% of the breaches in our data set, the initial compromise succeeded in hours or less. And the next row is data exfiltration, and that succeeded about 2/3 of the time in hours or less. And then look at this, the next row is discovery. Look, 2/3 of the time it takes months or longer just to discover that you've been breached. Containment's another thing, how long it takes, and that's a larger, different sort of issue. But just to point out how quickly these things happen and how bad we as an industry are in general at discovering them. And when they do get discovered, who discovers them? Well, in our data set, 1/3 of the time it's an unrelated third party. That is to say, not a card brand, not law enforcement, just somebody else that's doing an investigation or monitoring something, and they call up an organization and say, hey, guys, hate to tell you this, but in the course of this other investigation, we're pretty sure that you've been owned. How do you know? Well, you know, we're investigating this other system, and we found evidence, blah, blah, blah. Fraud detection, this is things like common point of purchase from card brands. So if you ever see like PCI-related investigations, PFI, that's what that is. So look at the top 5 methods are all external. That's not good, because look at the bottom methods, all the internal methods, the one that organizations spend so much time and energy and effort either implementing or at least convincing auditors that they've implemented and we suck at those. Okay, a big part of that might be things like, okay, we install this system, we make sure all the data is flowing so that the auditors get off our back, and we're doing log management, not analysis. And we have intrusion prevention systems, so we're preventing these things from happening, so we don't have to look. Well, hopefully everybody in this room kind of knows why that's a total fail too. So this is the motivation, right, of why we need to get better at trying to discover things more quickly and hopefully ourselves, because honestly, so my team, we do a lot of breach notifications. A lot of organizations like ours do as well. Ours, like a lot of them, are completely separate from a sales process. I'm not a salesperson by any stretch of the imagination. So if somebody from my team calls your CISO and leaves a voicemail, hey, we're not trying to sell you anything, we've got some information about your network that you really need to know, please call us back. Seriously, call us back. Where do we get data on threat? Where kinds of places can we grab this information from? One way to do that is there's a tool sponsored by the REN-ISAC, Research and Education Network. Basically, it's the ISAC for colleges and research institutions and things like that. And they got a team out there with Wes Young and Gabriel Iovino and some other guys. And they've written a tool called SIF, Collective Intelligence Framework, that sucks in a bunch of feeds originally from public sources, though you can configure it to pull in from your own stuff, right? So if you've got a SIM and it's like, oh, here are all the folks that are, trying to brute force passwords or port scan you, whatever, you can suck those things in anyway. David J. Bianco, who's a really smart guy, has a blog at detectrespondblogspot.com, talks about what he calls the pyramid of pain. And that's not a WWE thing, even though it kind of sounds like it. The idea is that the easiest stuff to gather is the stuff that's probably the lowest value, and the stuff that is the hardest to gather is also the stuff that makes it the most difficult for your attackers. So SIF really focuses on the lower levels here. IP addresses, is there anybody really that can't harvest IP addresses that are doing bad things? Okay, that's pretty straightforward, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about that and where to get them. Domain names, almost as easy. When you start getting to network artifacts, what to look for in traces, host artifacts, now you have to work a little bit harder both to get that information and to use it. Now you talk about specific tools and TTPs, tools, techniques, and procedures, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. Now it's really tough, but it's tough on both ends. Because on the one hand, it's tough to get this information, it's tough to use it, but that's where you can also bring the pain to the adversary, to the threat actor that's acting against your network. And SIF lets you do lookups, right? It lets you, please don't ask me why 20 years later I still remember the name server IP address from my university, but it's like the example I always still use. So you can query for an IP address and see if it shows up in any of the feeds. You can query for a domain name. You could pull out feeds. You can say, show me everything that is an IP address related to malware where I have a 50% confidence or more, right? And you can then go match that against, say, your network traffic or whatever. And what it does is it pulls in sources from pulls in data from a bunch of different sources. There's just tons of sources everywhere. Abuse.ch is fantastic. Alien Vault is another great source. They actually aggregate a bunch of them. So that's probably like the easiest big hitters to get a couple of these. All of these folks provide lists of these different kind of what we talked about before, the lower end of the pyramid of pain. I just like the way it sounds when I say that. Sorry. And you can collate these into, whether it's SIF, whether or not you write your own, there are tools that can feed it directly into your SIM, like, ArcSight or whatever it is that you're using. And there's a bunch of these that you can feed in. And so what do you do with these? You go back and you look at some detection stuff. You go back and you may not necessarily use it for blocking. I don't really recommend that in most cases because, the confidence level in any of these may not be 100%, right? Other things that are good to use are passive DNS. I love passive DNS. Like, I would marry it if it was legal. Well, I'm already married, so I have to go to Utah to do that, but who knows? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, Utah folks. I apologize. That was inappropriate. ISC provides a DNS database. What passive DNS is really simple. It's not actually going and looking, but it's not doing like a recursive DNS lookup like you typically think. Okay, do I have this cached in my local DNS server? No, I'm going to go find out who the authoritative is. Okay, everybody here probably knows how DNS works. What this does is this caches and keeps a historical record of the responses. So, if you look up a particular domain name from a particular time, or not even a particular domain name, I want to see all the IP addresses that you know about that showed up in somebody's actual query. So what it does is all these organizations kind of pull it together, or you can get it from different sources, and they cache the response. Well, at this time, somebody made a request for this domain address, and I got back this resource record. And this is what you get. So you see, okay, on April 4th at 1955, this particular domain, which by the way was related to, I'm not just like making these up, this is actual live data from, I believe this was a domain used that was used to serve malware preying on people who were looking for information about the Boston Marathon bombings and the West Texas disaster that same week. So these, and then at the next day at 1:59, another IP address, right? Probably like a fast flux domain. So these types of sources, where do you get these? Well, ISC has one. There's another one called BFK from a company in Germany that does something similar but more related to, like VirusTotal. They do the same thing. Basically, when they do analysis on something, or in VirusTotal's cases, when they analyze a sample, it caches all of those DNS responses. So you can see, if you search for an IP address in VirusTotal, it will tell you via its passive DNS, hey, this was the response that we got, and here's the malware sample that tried to look it up and our sandbox caught it. Super cool. Malware data in general, if that's the type of threat data that you are looking for, okay, so VirusTotal, hopefully everybody here is kind of familiar with it. If not, it is probably the most well-known, certainly not the only good one, but the most well-known site for public data on malware. You can search by hash, you can search by domain name, URL, a bunch of other different indicators, and as we mentioned before, it includes passive DNS related to these malware callouts. I really don't know how to pronounce the next one, if it's supposed to be malware.com or malware.com. I don't know if the guys who wrote it aren't Welsh, so I don't know why they don't have more vowels in there. Additional data in here, it's kind of similar to VirusTotal. They have feeds of recent samples. Here are all the hashes we got recently. I think there's a feed of fuzzy hashes, but I could be wrong on that. Of other types of indicators related to Shadow Server, who they have a lot of different projects. You probably see their name pop up a bunch of times, so they do fantastic work kind of in this general area of trying to track badness, if you will, on the internet. VirusShare.com is a whole different sort of thing. It's a relatively large repo. The last time I looked, a couple of months ago, they were up to over 3 terabytes of malware samples. Index searchable, so you can go search for a hash, and it says, oh yeah, we've got this information on it, and if you want a copy of it, it's in this kind of sub-repository. What they do is they have a bunch of like about 25 to 30 gigabyte kind of sub-repos that are shared via BitTorrent. Hopefully your ISP doesn't think that you're like pirating movies or whatever. It is like the others, these are community, well, okay, VirusTotal is owned by Google now, but malware.com and VirusShare.com are community sites, so anybody can help out with these. They're pretty fantastic. Aside an example, a few months ago, I guess now it's been more than a few months, but several months ago, another forensic investigation organization released a pretty well-known, well-read report on a threat actor that they located in Shanghai, China, right? They released this big report. Everybody talked about it. And there were a bunch of indicators in the technical appendices, which are fantastic. They matched up well with what a lot of people who had been tracking this particular group had. But it was interesting. So they released hashes for the malware. People said, well, can we get the malware? No, we can't share that with you. That's, not data that we're allowed to give out. I understand. Well, people that went and searched on virusshare.com for these hashes, about half of them were there. So it's not just commodity stuff that's there. A lot of people will upload samples that then get used later on for that type of research. Okay, so that's just general threat data, the lower end of the pyramid of pain. What about threat actors? After all, really, in the end, all of this stuff, there's a human being or a set of human beings behind it. Well, what is a threat actor? First of all, it's not Gary Oldman, even though he's a fantastic villain. And I guess now Benedict Cumberbatch, I guess I should use him now because he was so awesome in the new Star Trek movie, and if he was the only awesome part in it. A threat actor in this case are entities, human beings, or sets of human beings that cause or contribute to an incident. Generally speaking, a threat actor doesn't have to act with malicious intention. In this case, we're focused on those that do. So somebody who deliberately violates policy in an organization to make turning off their password on their BlackBerry, as we heard this morning, can be a threat actor in an incident sense, but we're not really cared about tracking that because you know who your executives or losers are. Sources for information on this, it depends on the type of threat actor that you're looking at. So if you're looking at, for example, hacktivists, or at least certain types of hacktivists, Twitter has tremendous amounts of information on it. Pastebin does. Pastebin has cracked down a little bit on some of the scrapers, partly because a lot of the scrapers are really impolite and are causing big load spikes there. So there's a couple different ways that you can be monitoring Pastebin for interesting stuff. There's a lot of spam on Pastebin that you don't want to have to wade through. But if you follow, for example, Pastebin Dorks on Twitter does a lot of this for you, so you could follow that. Google Alerts, hopefully everybody's familiar with it. What Google Alerts really does is give you periodic updates on new information that shows up when they are crawling the web for certain terms. They can be in just news articles, it can be in blogs, it can be in whatever. So if you're monitoring a specific actor and you're just trying to find out information that gets posted about them, this can be pretty fantastic for groups that have a little bit of publicity around them. If what you're looking for is a little bit more commodity, this is for stuff that is not necessarily going to be super targeted, but if you're interested in defacements and incidents like that, these two sites typically mirror that stuff. They have really good records of it. There was another one called OSDC that is, as far as is offline due to some financial problems the admin had. But they tracked things like leaks of email addresses and passwords and things like that. So these are, again, sources of data to bring in. How do we store all this information? Because, oh my God, drinking from the fire hose like in UHF, right? Well, one, you can use some basic web tools, Evernote, Feedly, IFT. IFT is kind of like, it means if this, then that. So it's a kind of one of these Web 2.0, social web types of sites where you say, okay, when this happens to this site, when I tag an item in Delicious, I want you to tweet that. Or when I get this, when the weather happens like this, I want you to send me an SMS or whatever. So you can glue all these things together that way for relatively easy stuff. That might be fine as a proof of concept, but you really wouldn't want to use that in an organization for doing any kind of serious work because it's not that flexible. But fortunately, everything has APIs just about these days. So you can use a simple scripting language like Python. I guess if you're a hipster programmer, you could use Ruby, but who wants to be a hipster programmer? I'm sorry, I probably offended all the Rubyists in here today. You could store this stuff in a document-oriented type database like Mongo or something like that. This is really flexible if you do it this way. This is what we do. We suck in a lot of this information, stored in there so that even if it disappears later, we have a record of it. That requires a lot more effort, obviously, but this is a great way to suck in kind of this relatively unstructured data and store it for these purposes. Okay, so now you have all of this data. Well, Intel is not just data. If this was the case, we would be done here and go home. We have saved the internet, and that's not true. So there's a fantastic tool called Maltego. This is not open source software, although they're really cool guys out of South Africa. And what Maltego does, it lets you create these types of graphs. I guess you can't really see here, but there are links between these different nodes. And each node could be a person, it could be a URL, it could be an IP address, a malware hash, a registry key, whatever. And you link them together, and then the real power is in running transforms. Well, a simple example to explain a transform is I have a node that represents a domain name, and I run a transform to get the IP address. Now I have two nodes that are linked. The domain name resolves to this IP address. And then you can do, let's say, reverse DNS on that IP address and get all the domains that resolve back to it. And then you can get the who is information and who owns those domains, and you see where this is going. You don't just have to use their transforms. In fact, I don't really recommend it because what they give you is just kind of the generic tool set that is not enough, almost certainly, for what you need. Am I doing on time here? Okay. Canary is a project, open source project, to simplify the development of writing these transforms. It's already pretty straightforward, but this kind of gives you a framework both to write them and deploy them locally, because you have to do a lot of work typically in the client to say, hey, I've written this transform, I want you to use it when it's for these types of, so it's for IP addresses when I want to do a passive DNS lookup. Canary simplifies, you don't have to go do all the work on the client just to set that up. On our team, principally written by a guy on my team, although a lot of us have contributed code to it, we use a tool called Malformity, which, despite the name Malware Transforms Entities, we use it to track a lot of types of bad infrastructure, if you will. It is also open source, and you can use it. It works in conjunction with Canary and pull it down. And what it does is something relatively simple. So let's use this as an example. It's a little bit fuzzy here, but I'll walk you through it. At the top, we have an initial link that was a URL to a malvertising site. Okay? And that redirected you actually to an exploit server. So that's what the ones here are. Well, from there, we use Malformity to say, okay, those are the URLs. Let's grab the websites. From the websites, we derive the domain. The domain, we get the IP addresses. And then from there, we would say, okay, what other servers are hosted, what other domains, rather, are hosted on that IP address? Look, all of those look suspicious. Those are bad things. So now we have a start anyway. I'm looking at this bad sort of infrastructure. You can kind of see over here in the yellow where we started mapping out the entire infrastructure. And so Malformity lets us write some additional or have some additional transforms to do that. It also lets you do things like look up specific hashes at VirusTotal and Malware.com and at ThreatExpert and a few places like that, so you can start to do some analysis there. We see here. So you can do a hash to domains, dropped files, hash to IP. So if you have a hash, what other information can I get out of it? You can do all this in Maltego. Maltego is really not a tool for data storage. It's a tool for interactive analysis. So then you would want to go store this information somehow. There's different ways to do that. If you are storing and analyzing malware samples, there's a couple different ways to do it. One is if you just have a relatively small set, maybe your working set of samples for a particular investigation, Malwarehouse, written by Scott Roberts, who's a fantastic DFR guy and a guy I like to think of as a friend at GitHub. It's a relatively simple database here, right, where you can import samples. It grabs some initial metadata like the fuzzy hash, time that maybe you can tell it what the source you got it from, and so forth. It doesn't scale to large sets, so I wouldn't use it for more than like 100 or 200 samples myself. VxCage is a much larger, complete database. It's also a lot more complicated to use and work with because it's so much more powerful. Think MS Paint compared to Photoshop. right? Scott's going to hate me that I called his stuff MS Paint now, but that's what it is. Think of this as your big, complete repository. So let's say that you pulled in every piece of malware that you ever think may get detected in your organization, and you pull in virus share and whatever else, and you want to store it all in there. This is where you would do it. If anybody is working with malware and doing dynamic analysis, you probably at least have heard of Cuckoo. Now, there are commercial projects that do similar stuff, but Cuckoo is still pretty much fantastic. And what it does is it runs malware inside a sandbox, tries to do a little behavior analysis. I mean, it even captures screenshots of what happens, which is good for things like ransomware or the olden, like 2 years ago, olden days, fake AV before ransomware. People realized that, hey, there's like a 4x uptake on that stuff. It integrates with VirusTotal, explodes an API, written Python, fantastic for doing analysis on that stuff. So as you bring all these in, you could, as an example, every time you detect a piece of malware, run it in a sandbox, whether you have Cuckoo or whether or not you go buy one from a vendor. In fact, one of the sponsors here does that, and they do really good work. And Cuckoo Sandbox will then let you analyze that stuff directly. There are a number of standards for exchanging threat intel. So first let's talk about these, and then we'll talk a little bit in a minute about who to exchange it with. So OpenIOC and Cybox are two very similar, though not identical, standards, one from Mandiant, one from the MITRE Corporation, which is one of those federally funded, kind of semi-private, not really, research corporations. And basically in both cases, they do kind of the same thing. They try to capture something that you can actually observe, something stateful. So a file hash, an IP, a particular string in an HTTP GET request, whatever. And there's a little bit, it's not just one piece. So you can say if you see these 5 things, if you do an AND on all 5 of these things, or you see these other 2 things, and so you can put a little bit of Boolean logic into them and look for specific indicators. And you say, aha, this fits. Now we're going to set up a flare and say that we have observed something related to whatever you think this was. This was a particular rat, or this was indication of a particular attacker you've been tracking, or it's just something bad. Ermagerd, somebody installed Nmap on their local machine. Symantec would tell you that that's a virus or something, right? Or any antivirus, right? But that's the idea. It's kind of a way of writing your own signatures, if you will. But that doesn't give you any context. That doesn't tell you much. It just tells you it is this. Sticks is kind of a layer up from that, if you will, in the stack. You can give context to this data. So you have these observables. What does it mean? Well, you create a sticks document related back to a Cybox document, and sticks lets you specify a whole bunch of different things. You can say, okay, this is typically related to this campaign. You can have a whole document on a campaign. You can say it's related to this particular set of threat actors. We recommend this course of action. They typically exploit these types of targets. So you can put a lot of context around that because, like a lot of things in life, intelligence data without context is just bits. Okay, so what? What do I do with this? Reminds me of years ago. And this is true of a lot of different things. If you're doing pen testing, years ago I worked with a client with their previous web app tester had really, this was like 10, 12 years ago, right? Had run just kind of one of those generic, I think it was like a Web Inspect or whatever, just give them the default 1,200-page report from the application scanner and handed it to the client, said, here you go. And they looked at him and literally in the meeting said, what am I going to do with this? Wipe up my butt with it? So it was just a bunch of information they couldn't do anything with. Well, the same thing here. You want to give some context to this rather than just getting the flow from, let's say, ADS, whatever. Like, okay, great, this is all bad stuff. What does that tell me? That is for kind of using those standards to organize and communicate those data. When you want to kind of generalize this a little bit, you need to keep track of this in a way that your human analysts The men and women who understand what they're looking at can sit down and go through it and extract useful information that they can then provide to an appropriate decision maker. Scott Roberts, again, name pops up, has a set of templates on his GitHub that you can use. You can also create your own if you don't like his, I guess, or at least use them as a starting point. That's what we did. And you can, what they are essentially is creating a wiki. So you can have a wiki with different pages for different artifacts that you've looked at, different types of exploits, intrusion sets, particular actors that you're interested in. So you're like, okay, we've heard a lot about this particular hacking team. We're worried about it because they hit our sister organization last month, and we need to keep an eye on what they're doing. And you can then automatically pull in, let's say, data from your document database we talked about a moment ago to bring all of this together. That's for kind of the generic threat intelligence, actor intelligence sorts of information. If you're talking about IOCs, well, that's probably not the right way to do it because you want to automate this to a degree. So you want to pull feeds from SIF or whatever other tool, like we've got one internally that we use now that we've written in-house that focuses on our particular needs and works with some of the internal organizations we feed data to, into your SIM, so you can at least kind of do some matching there. That's just kind of a basic start because that's really turning this into signatures that iterate a little bit faster. You want to be able to do more than that, though. You also want to be able to not just match on your network, right, but also you want to be able to sweep hosts. Well, there are a lot of commercial tools that do this, and a lot of folks who will sell you a solution that can go, you can go put an agent on a system. It's basically the same basic idea as antivirus, but try to do a little bit more with it. So you can grab evidence from a system and you can sweep for particular things that you want to look for rather than whatever the folks back at McAfee or Symantec, whoever tell you are bad, as where they've done a lot of the work for you. But you may have specific things you want to look for. Well, there's a couple of tools you can use. PyIOC is one. There's another one, I don't have the link here, but if you search for GRR on Google Code, it's the Google Rapid Response Framework. It's basically something similar. It's what Google actually uses internally. And you can talk to their IR guys about it. They're pretty happy to talk about it. And what it really, the idea behind all of these things, commercial or not, is you put a little agent on a system and you say, I want to sweep for these particular indicators of compromise, or I want to pull back a memory image or a registry dump or a list of running processes or whatever so that I can match it against things that I'm looking for. In general, this area of general threat analysis is really where the work happens. Everything else we talked about before is building stuff to get to this point. And this is the part where you can't automate it anymore. You have automated everything you can automate, and you still have to do this stuff. This is where you need smart people, give them the time and resources that we talked about, to be able to go through these data and understand your business and understand who your adversaries might be. So in my previous gig, I worked at a payment processor. Well, we kind of had an understanding, at least at a high level, of who our adversaries were. People who want money because we're processing, billions of dollars of transactions or whatever every so often. So we had a particular set of types of things that we cared about, whereas we didn't care, we were processing credit cards. We didn't care as much about nation-state actors because nation-state actors aren't really cared about credit card numbers. They might care about business plans, for example, but not what we were doing. Vice versa, an R&D shop, right, needs to understand the type of adversaries that they might have, especially if they don't have any type of payment information or things like that. So this is where the work happens, the real work. This is where somebody's going to go through and kind of analyze and understand that we've seen these indicators. This is like the pattern that we've seen for this particular threat actor that we've been tracking, and now I need to get in touch with somebody else who can help work with us on a working group or a task force or law enforcement or what have you, which is where you need to be able to collaborate. Well, how are you going to do this effectively? A couple different things you need to keep in mind. One is try to use standards. Okay, at the most basic level, sure, you can send a CSV, and for some types of things that might be fine. Hey, here's a CSV of IP addresses to look for. That's kind of the state of the art that in terms of what people are actually using. today. It's far better than, just some human-written email that somebody will get to when they can. But you want to use a standard like OpenIOC or Cybox, preferably even build on that to something like Styx. And there's a lot of work in a lot of different communities, sub-communities, if you will, to do these things. Trust groups are not open sources. These are, for lack of a better term, the good old boy network. And I like to think that as time goes on, we're going to kind of, I don't want to say leave behind, because there's always a place for, having a group of people that you know and trust. There's something to be said to be able to share some information with somebody that you trust well enough that he knows that you know that he knows. No, he knows that if he misuses it, you may come sock him in the nose at the next, happy hour or whatever. So it's not open source, strictly speaking, but one of the ways to get in is to do good work, keep at least some relevant parts of it in public, and that can be a very significant and targeted boost, because a lot of these groups focus on specific threat actors or specific types of threat actors at least. And you can now start to collaborate on this threat intelligence. Hey, we've been tracking this threat actor, we've seen this. Can anybody tell me more about this that they might know? And somebody else, some other really smart person at another company, she might say, well, we saw X as well. You want to look for this, and we've been talking to these other organizations here. Let me put you in touch with somebody. Another way to collaborate is, if there is one thing that we need in general in this community, it's people who know how to write code. There are not a lot of us, unfortunately, who can do any kind of coding. There's a lot of, I have this whole rant. In fact, I'll be at the Sands DFIR Summit ranting about this, about IT security people who think, well, I'm not a developer, so I don't need to be able to write any code. Well, if you can write at least some code, GitHub is a great place as a place to kind of start working on some of these projects. I mentioned a few of them. You can search for the ones that are interesting to you, and a lot of them are there now that they've kind of been moving away from Google Code or, heaven forbid, SourceForge. And not just developers, right? So even if you're using it, you say, this is the way that I use it, it's kind of a pain because it doesn't really lend it to this workflow. We love that kind of stuff because, hey, my workflow might be very different from yours, and either A, you might have a better idea, and I'm happy to enable your idea because it lets me also work that way, or B, just in general, kind of try to do the right thing, like we talked about earlier with notifying people that have been compromised, or when we talk about working with trusted groups. A lot of this is trying to, be a good netizen, if you will. I'm not trying to. If I see somebody break into my neighbor's house, I'm not going to go over there and try to sell him an alarm system. I'm going to tell him that, dude, somebody broke into your house while you're away. You need to, check things out. Adversaries talk to each other on some level, right? We see this when we see recently with the takedown of Liberty Reserve and all the panic in certain kind of threat actor community, adversary communities, quote unquote bad guys. Well, we have to do the same thing, because otherwise, if we're divided and they're working together, whereas we already have enough strikes against us, that makes it that much more challenging. As we wrap up, and we'll certainly take questions, these are some of the folks that are doing really great work in this area. If you use Twitter, I love Twitter. I use it all the time, and I see a bunch of people here that I follow that are really smart people. These are some other smart people to follow, to get some information from, and just to kind of collaborate with. And I recommend every one of them as somebody that can, at least in their area of expertise, talk to you more about these things if they feel like talking. I don't want to volunteer them for stuff. So with that said, where is stuff moving in the future? What do we need to do more of? Well, in the public domain at least, okay, sure, the folks that work, in behind closed doors at all kinds of different places, they may have their own ways of doing stuff. In the areas that are visible to the rest of us, to the great unwashed masses, if you will, threat actor tracking is relatively not that great. We need to do a better job of. Scott, for example, Lieutenant Scott Roberts has his templates, and that's just a start. There's a lot of attention on getting better at sharing low-end IOCs, and while I won't call that a solved problem in the way that, software patching, okay, not everybody's doing it, but we all kind of understand how it should be done, and we're kind of getting there with this stuff. So now we need to move up that pyramid of pain to the TTPs, whether that's machine learning or something else. If you want to talk more about this after the question and answer session, you can come find me. I'll be here both days. You can find me. The best way to reach me is on Twitter, by far. My wife probably hates that because I'm always tweeting. But you can also email me here or see me later if you want to exchange personal email addresses. That's cool too. With that said, I'd like to take any questions that anybody has. Or did I put everybody to sleep? I know it's getting close to lunchtime. Want a sandwich? You just had coffee. Yes, ma'am. Do we use any of the standards at Verizon? I'm glad you asked that. Yes. At least internally, we use that. We are pushing to use more of them more widely. So I would say it is in its infancy where I am. We have, I'm not telling you details out of school here, we have a lot of different internal organizations. We're like 200,000 person organization, right? We have, that I know of, at least 4 different intel groups, for example. There are probably more that I don't know about. And we try to work together. We're trying to get better at that. And this is, so when I talk about this, it's because I see the pain of exchanging, PDFs all the time and, just personal emails. So we're trying to get better at that and move towards this stuff. We also use it, we work, like a lot of critical infrastructure type companies, the DHS has an organization called the NCCIC, NCCIC, National Cyber Critical Infrastructure Command or something, I don't know, NCCIC. And they use some standards as well internally that we're starting to be able to exchange data. It's mostly them sending us data more than anything else. Because if we send data to them, it just goes into a black hole and who knows what happens. We do share data with them on a targeted basis, though. But I don't have anything to do with any of the things you've heard in the news. So please don't ask me questions about that because I don't know. I'm like, what? Yes, sir. Yes, at a more limited role. So the question was, I able to do this at my previous employer. So it's not a big secret where I worked, but where I worked was a place that I came in to lead the incident response after they had a really well-known and big, famous, popular breach. If you find me on LinkedIn, it makes it really obvious who it was. And we were working on these things. In fact, because it was a financial services company, I mentioned it was a payment processor, the FSISAC in particular is putting a lot of time and effort into doing these sorts of things among each other because banks and financial institutions in general, they have a vested interest in making everybody feel like that whole sector is secure. Because when you hear about a bank that gets owned, you don't think, oh, I have money with that bank, I should go move it to this other bank. You think, oh my God, banks are in terrible shape, which may or may not be true, but people think that. So this is why you don't see banks picking at each other in public of, ha ha ha, they're insecure and we're not, because they don't want anybody to think that the other banks are insecure too. They want to compete with them in other ways. So where I was not a bank, but it had the same sort of mentality of we wanted everybody to have a confidence in credit card processing, right? Because that was to everybody's benefit. So as I go around and talk to our clients or just to other, kind of organizations privately, there are a number of non-critical infrastructure kind of grassroots organizations growing up. So retailers are starting to work together on this, even though they're not critical infrastructure. But hey, my wife is not a technical person, but if she hears the department store got owned, she's not going to think, I shouldn't go to that department store anymore. She's going to think, am I safe shopping at department stores? So they're all starting to kind of work together for the same reasons. Just a few more minutes, so if you have any other questions, this is a great time to ask them. If you think of them later and you want to ask me, feel free. Yes, ma'am, again. Well, I will tell you what I am pushing for. How's that? I am personally pushing for more use of the Sticks, Cybox, mic. There's another one, I forget what it's called, Stack from MITRE. I think they've done great work. I think there's a lot more work to do there, partly because I hate XML and I love JSON. And it's a little bit kind of opaque when you first get into it. It takes some work to untangle. But in general, I think, this is my personal opinion, don't impute this to Verizon, please. My personal opinion is that way is the future because you need context and not just observables. Time for one last question, if there is one. Yes, sir. is my organization using machine learning for any of this research? We are, I will say, using it on a researching type basis, so not in production, no. A number of us in different parts of my company have relevant backgrounds, we'll say. So, my degree's in statistics. There are guys with similar backgrounds. And so we are starting to do some internal research. My job is a research type job anyway, so we are starting to apply that. If you've got interest in those things, please do reach out to me, because this is an area where I'm putting a lot of time and effort, and so a lot of other folks in our organization right now. Again, if you have any other questions, please feel free. I love to talk about this stuff. I'm sure you couldn't tell. I'll be here all today, at the happy hour tonight, all day tomorrow. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. If it is relatively private, you can either ask me to follow you back in DM, or you can email me, and I will try to remember to look at it, because I suck at emails. My boss frequently reminds me. With that, I think the right way to conclude is mahalo. Oh, sweet.